Today's panel is going to look at the impact of international CSR standards. Have they been able to influence company behavior, country behavior, legislation, etc.? And we have a very rich panel and very different backgrounds, so I think it's going to be a good discussion. On my immediate left, we have Chip Pitts, who is familiar to people at Stanford. He teaches law here, and he is the former chief legal officer from Nokia. And he was involved in drafting their code of conduct, which included human rights as early as 1997. And he'll speak more from he's going to be the last speaker, and he's going to look at it from the macro view. And he was also involved in the drafting of the UN norms for multinational companies. And then we have Monica, who is a senior manager from Gap. And incidentally, we were on the same panel last year at Net Impact, which was, we just realized that. Monica is representing Gap, which, of course, as you know, manages some of the most recognized brand names. So compliance with standards, the reputational risk is an important issue for companies like Gap. And she's going to talk about from the perspective of her sector, the garment sector. And then we have Alison, who is representing Verite, and a client or Gap is a client of Verite, and so whatever Monica says has been verified by Verite. So you can, in fact, if you have questions about it, then you can direct them to Alison because she's signed off on them. But Alison is representing an organization that is able to work with different stakeholders, not just the corporate sector, but they're also working with labor unions, governments, organizations like mine, and they are, in my view, the leading auditing company, but they don't just audit, they also provide capacity building and workshop and remedial solutions to their clients. So we're going to start with Monica, and then Alison, and then Chip is going to put it in a larger perspective, and then we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Okay.
It's only for the camera.
Oh, it is. Okay. Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to quite an interesting discussion this afternoon. Hopefully we've got some good questions. I'd like to focus a little bit just on Gap's experience in the last 10 years with CSR standards, in particular labor standards for the factories that make our clothing. I think it's fair to say that our experience is very much tied to that of the apparel industry as a whole. Sweatshops have long been associated with apparel and footwear, arguably more so than they have been with other industries, although they certainly exist in a lot of places. As the apparel industry globalized in the 1980s and 1990s, sweatshops in developing countries, in particular those associated with U.S. and European retailers, became a topic of particular public concern. In 1991, Levi Strauss was the first company to develop a code of conduct to regulate labor standards in its third-party suppliers. A year later, Gap followed suit and developed its own internal sourcing guidelines, which outlined general labor standards for our suppliers. What neither we nor just about anybody else at the time realized was that simply outlining a set of standards isn't enough to bring about sustainable change. This is particularly true when you consider the types of supply chains that are common in this industry. They're mostly comprised of third-party suppliers that we don't own or operate, we just contract with them. This became abundantly clear to us in 1995. 3 years after we had developed our sourcing guidelines, we began to receive alarming reports of labor rights abuses at the Mandarin International Factory in El Salvador. When we sent down our employees to investigate, they returned with first-hand accounts of low pay, forced overtime, and reported union busting. It's fair to say that Mandarin was a wake-up call for us. It was clear that simply having a standard isn't enough. You also need to enforce that standard. So although a lot of other brands at Mandarin simply left, we decided to stay and try to be part of the solution. We partnered with 3 organizations, BSR, the Center for Reflection, Education, and Action, and the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility to form an independent monitoring working group. And the group engaged Timaeus, which is a Salvadorian civil society organization focused on the maquila sector, and this effort marked the first independent monitoring program in the industry. At the same time, we also began to build our internal monitoring program. In 1996, we revised our sourcing guidelines into our first Code of Vendor Conduct, which is still in place today, and it's based on the ILO core conventions. We also hired our first vendor compliance officer, whose sole job was to monitor factory conditions. Today, this team has expanded to over 90 individuals based in 25 countries around the world, and I'm part of this team. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years since Mandarin. First and foremost, we've seen that progress is possible, especially when a wide variety of stakeholders are engaged in the area. And probably the best example of this is child labor. It was tragically fairly widespread in the industry some years ago. I think it's fair to say that particularly in factories that produce for multinational companies, it's not a common occurrence anymore. We've learned, though, that you can't make the kind of long-term progress that we want to make by working alone. A single company standard and enforcement of that standard isn't enough. For one thing, we're not the only company in the industry. Although we were one of the first to address the issue, many have now followed suit. And although this is a positive development because the more people you have focused, the better, one of the downsides is that manufacturers are now subject to multiple audits against multiple standards with varying degrees of remediation and follow-up. I think one of the best examples of this is fire extinguishers. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this, but I've seen it in some of our factories. Different companies have different regulations for what the fire extinguisher should be. So you go in and they've got several hooks on the wall, and depending on who's visiting, they just move the fire extinguisher around to get it to the requisite height. Now, this is pretty ridiculous. This doesn't do anything for actually helping the workers, and it makes the manufacturers confused. So it's led to what we call audit fatigue. Another one of the issues that we face is that many of the issues we find are really representative of systemic problems that can't be addressed just through monitoring. A good example of this would be excessive overtime hours. If a factory has poor production processes or it's got inefficient planning, then it's the workers that have to make up the difference to get the product out on time. Another example would be freedom of association violations. If workers aren't aware of their rights, if management is suspicious of worker empowerment, then you're going to run into all sorts of problems. So to address these issues and to try to lay a foundation for a long-term sustainable progress in the industry, we've learned that we need to reach out to other concerned organizations and stakeholders. These are NGOs, trade unions, governments, other brands, and we need to build partnerships that leverage all of our efforts, and they jointly address these kinds of problems. Sometimes these partnerships are capacity-building programs, such as those that train workers on their rights. We've got a couple examples at the moment in Guatemala and China, which you can read about in our 2004 report, or they teach management techniques for supervisors, and there's a great program going on at the moment in Cambodia around this. Other times, they're multi-stakeholder initiatives, like the Ethical Trading Initiative in the UK or Social Accountability International, which is based in New York. And we see these as forums where we can really sit down with lots of people from different backgrounds and jointly address issues and sort of hash out these complex problems. We also believe that sustainable change requires a greater alignment of standards and expectations. Manufacturers need to have a clear understanding of what we and others expect of them, and companies like ourselves need to be held accountable to these standards. And on that front, I'd like to mention two particular initiatives that we're involved in at the moment. One is the Joint Initiative on Corporate Accountability and Workers' Rights, which is comprised of 6 key multi-stakeholder initiatives. It has a pilot program going on in Turkey at the moment. Included in this is the Ethical Trading Initiative and SAI that GAP is a member of. The Joint Initiative is working to develop a common code of conduct, and as well as a common method to enforce that code. And certainly we're looking to that as potentially the initiative that will lead to a uniform highest common denominator standard in the industry. We're also participating on the Global Reporting Initiatives Working Group to develop a common set of reporting indicators for the apparel and footwear industries. We've certainly learned with our first and second public reports that public reporting on CSR issues brings about greater discipline and better management within a company. Unfortunately, at the moment, though, there is no single standard against which all companies can be measured. And so we see our work with GRI as essential in bringing about greater standardization and transparency in public reporting, and this is absolutely essential to greater corporate accountability. So I just want to conclude by saying we certainly hope that our efforts to develop common standards, whether it's the performance standard through the Joint Initiative or the reporting standard through GRI, as well as on many other fronts with many other stakeholders, will serve to bring about a greater understanding of these issues, more and better solutions to some of these problems, and ultimately will help lay the foundation for long-term sustainable change in the industry.
Thank you. Alison, then if you could tell us, you're not only working with the garment sector, but many different sectors, and you're not just auditing, and your organization has led some of the movement itself, so if you could tell us about the variety of the things that are happening.
Well, thanks for having me here today, and I want to say that it's encouraging to see how big this conference has become. I know that the founder of our organization, Verite, she started the organization 10 years ago, and before that she was a buyer's agent in China, and she was looking at the factories and the conditions in the factories and the fires and the child labor issues. And she was disturbed by the conditions, but what actually was more disturbing is when she came back to the United States and she was teaching a class at MIT on labor issues at the business school. And the reaction of the business school students in terms of the concern and thought process into what should actually be done on the global supply within the global supply chain on these issues. So it's exciting to see sort of how many people are interested and engaged in these initiatives, both at the MBA and higher level education level, and also in the industry. We were launched in 1995 actually as a monitoring organization. So, and the way we expanded is we started with one client and then 2 clients in a couple of countries. And then what we found is that when we were auditing factories on social and environmental and labor issues, that each company would talk to us about expanding to where they had factories. So our growth strategy is actually was fairly organic, and it was quick because we were expanding to countries around the world based upon the interests and needs of our clients. So we evolved into not just being a monitoring organization, but also we evolved in the industry into becoming sort of doing work on training and capacity building with corporations as well as government institutions, and working with NGOs and multi-stakeholders on how to affect change within the global supply chain. And we're a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to ensure that people worldwide work under safe, fair, and legal conditions. And that means both working in the corporate, with the larger corporations, the multinationals, and we're also looking at where does the informal sector fit within the global supply chain, the issues that we're working on. And as Khan mentioned, that we work across different industries. So we have worked to a great extent in the apparel industry, but we've worked in consumer electronics, we've worked in toys, we've worked in agriculture. We have clients like Nike and The Gap and Starbucks and McDonald's and Disney. And then we're also working with a number of different institutions like Calvert, the Calvert Group, which I think is represented at the conference. We've launched an initiative on women's issues. The Calvert Group came up with an initiative on advancing women in the workplace, looking at a comprehensive code of conduct to help sort of raise the bar in terms of the way companies are working throughout the supply chain on women's issues. Working with them on a bunch of different initiatives. We're also working with the State Department, looking at capacity building in China and how to look at the issues of law enforcement and protection and enforcement of codes in the factories. And we're also sort of meeting and engaging with a lot of different groups of multiple stakeholders on specific issues like overtime in the factories. And we're also looking at issues of capacity building within different countries and how we can have a more country-focused effort, and then also on improving standards, not just on some of the standards that we passed out to you, but looking also at standards of certification of the actual auditors, looking at the management system standards and what needs to be improved on the sort of systemic level and in the management levels within organizations. So I was trying to think about the sort of impact of standards and what we've been seeing. We work with about 250 institutions a year, and across the board, I would definitely say that we're seeing that the standards are kind of a catalyst for change, and we really believe that they're creating the dialogue for which a lot of the companies and organizations are coming to us and asking, what they can do in the world of sort of social responsibility, in the world of labor rights, how can they make improvements to their supply chain. There's a lot of innovation going on as a result of these variety of standards. Verite, we don't audit against one specific standard. We've actually created sort of a strategy of best practices, and we both audit against those best practices, which include standards like the ILO standards and FLA and certain corporate codes of conduct from companies that we think are really innovative. And then when we do work with companies like Gap, and we experience and learn new things about what might help to make improvements at the factory levels or other areas of the supply chain, we'll incorporate those into our services and the programs that we offer for the companies and other institutions. We have definitely found that the standards are helping to empower or actually create a dialogue around what's the impact of all of this work that's happening around the world on social responsibility, and definitely believe that there's a lot more progress. And there's been progress, but there's a way to go in terms of identifying what's the economic, social, and environmental impact of a lot of what's happening. And there's a lot of focus on inputs in terms of how much in resources is put towards work on the supply chain. But the question is, what's the overall impact on raising the social standard in various communities around the world? And we're just starting to get a lot of requests from corporations asking us, how can we measure this? Can you show us? Can you demonstrate? Does this mean increased productivity in our workplaces? Does this mean increased efficiencies? What does it mean in the community in terms of environmental impact? And then in terms of sort of progress, there's been a lot more sort of consolidation and dialogue across industries and across different companies on how to create a more common code of conduct. And one example is we're engaging in sort of growing our efforts in the electronic industry. So this morning, they talked about the HP sort of leadership in establishing the electronic industry code of conduct, and we're doing a lot of work to engage with the electronic industry, companies like HP and IBM, and also the larger factories in places like India and China, to look at what's actually been created as a common code amongst all the companies and factories. And they sort of base this upon lessons in the apparel industry, where it would maybe make it easier for their suppliers to have one common code. So the code's been launched, but the question is, in terms of standards, now they're looking to what kind of standards are we going to need in terms of people that are going to enforce this standard, people that are going to actually, how are they going to be trained, what's the certification process that someone needs to go through to be compliant, both at the factory levels and at the auditor levels. So these are just some examples of how we've seen sort of standards having an impact in the work that we're doing. And I would say that probably the greatest shifts that we've seen, especially with, working with companies like Gap and some of the more progressive sort of leaders in the apparel industry and the electronic industry, is a shift from policing to actually, it's kind of a paradigm shift to actually creating sort of sustainable change, and not just looking at auditing a factory and what the problems are, but really trying to figure out what are the best programs on a sort of global level that companies and other stakeholders can engage upon to address and resolve the solutions and the problems that they're identifying. And so that's been a major shift, and that's taken about 10 years for us to actually see this happen at the ground level. And we work in about over 60 countries and with a lot of different organizations, and it's really exciting to actually see the progress that is happening around the interest and engagement to not only look at the standards in terms of guidance, but also is resolving and creating sustainable solutions.
Thank you. And I think when we turn to you, Chip, I don't know if you had planned on talking on this, but what we're hearing is that there is some movement toward the convergence of standards. But then we just handed out this sheet which has about 28 standards.
Right.
And then we have codes, regulations, principles. We see the industry trying to maybe sometimes move ahead of the government before they're regulated. They want to come up with their voluntary. Then we step in, not the World Bank, but the OECD steps in. United Nations has its own. And so how does it all fit? Where are we going?
Well, it's really interesting, and thank you for moderating, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. Zach actually called me up and said, "You're a lawyer and a businessman, but do you believe in free speech?" And I said, "Well, sure. I've been involved in human rights as well. Would you like to give one?" So here I am. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be here, and this is a really exciting time. There are all of these different standards, and there has been, of course, a long-standing interaction between the private sector and the public sector. But I would say we're at a very momentous change in international law and the very international regime. In fact, it used to be called international law. Now it's starting to be recognized that old paradigm of international law may be changing, that legal standards as well as ethical standards are applying to business. And my basic theme, and I'm not going to go on very long because I'd like to get to your questions, is that these various standards are shaping a form of law. And it's the partnerships often between NGOs and private companies, but it's sometimes resulting in legal liability, as with the Unical case recently, which was a huge multi-million-dollar settlement over Unical's alleged complicity with the Burmese government in pipelines. But you also have ExxonMobil being sued for its activities in Indonesia and Aceh. You have Nike's issues. You have the historic issues of the Gap. A lot of the companies have been able to use codes of conduct to avoid litigation by internalizing these norms. And the norms are spreading both within the private companies, to the industries, as you've heard, and now to the global scene. And there's a whole spectrum of these codes. There are about at least 500 private company codes. I reviewed personally about 250 of them 5 years ago when we were starting to draft the norms, looking for common principles and the highest common denominator approach or lowest common denominator approach, the common principles. But in addition to that, we've seen the OEC guidelines on conduct, which is a multi-stakeholder approach involving not just private companies, but also unions and business and governments. So they have some legal normative force. You have the UN Compact. Although it's strictly voluntary, it's now 10 principles on human rights, labor rights, the environment, and corruption form a sort of law as people are using these expectations to shape behavior. And as I say, the codes, if you comply with them, can be a defense to conduct. They're actually considered by courts as a defense. But if you don't comply with your own stated norms and your rhetoric, you could be in big trouble. What are the drivers for this remarkable development where international law, the decline of state sovereignty, the rise of international organizations and their impact, the rise of private companies' influence on these common standards, what are the drivers? Well, obviously, globalization is the big one. But what does that mean? Some people say that this is nothing new, that we saw really the height of capital integration and so forth during the second wave of globalization, is the way people put it, at the time of the First World War, where there was that expansion until the war basically saw a retrenchment. The first wave, of course, would be the exploration period, but there wasn't a lot of integration then. But what we're seeing now is an unprecedented, really, interdependence, where you've got trillions of dollars in capital flowing around the world every day. You've got 24-hour capital markets, you've got trade going on at an unprecedented level, and you've got 24-hour media scrutiny, 24-hour cable news networks. You've now got Chavez talking about a new South American network to compete with CNN and so forth. You also have the explosive growth of NGOs that are questioning these companies. And so scrutiny is coming from all sorts of market actors, lending institutions. The lenders are concerned about risk. The institutional investors, all of these market drivers, plus the internal drivers, the employees of the companies, the executives want to do the right thing, and they want to, from a risk management perspective, avoid the liabilities that are emerging. So there are all sorts of drivers, and we can talk more about them in the question and answer period if you'd like. But the result is this new constellation of norms where there is growing common expectations: no forced labor, no child labor, do no harm, and then do what good you can. So negative and affirmative obligations. And that's what's represented in the UN norms for international business, which have evolved just in the last 6 years or so. They started with a little germ of an idea. A colleague of mine, Professor David Weisbrod from the University of Minnesota, was appointed the U.S. expert to the Subcommission on Human Rights, which was the expert body that advises the Commission of Human Rights. These are independent experts of judges and academics, there are 26 of them, that advise the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, the preeminent organization within the UN that deals with human rights issues, works with the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And he was looking for something to do that would respond to cutting-edge trends. And so we were talking about it, and this intersection between business and human rights was very much on my mind. I had just both put together Nokia's code of conduct on human rights, and Nokia, being a Finnish company, was uniquely able, I think. They really had wonderful values. The Finnish people, I don't know if you know them, are just fantastic people, very open and honest. They're at that extreme of Transparency International's index. And they also try to do the right thing. They're very moral people. So it was easy to, in fact, I was asked to do global corporate citizenship for them. And I suggested, well, let's have a code of conduct. It's like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. Let's have a show. Let's put a code of conduct together. And so we joined the, at that time, very few companies that explicitly and strongly committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, at the middle of last century, the key document that says that, for the first time in human history, you respect even your enemy's rights. And it explicitly says that private organs of society, as well as states and individuals, have human rights responsibilities. It says that in the preamble. Of course, that's hortatory language, and although some of it is viewed widely now as having become customary international law, at that time that was just a declaration. But then the treaties came into place, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. And these were stymied for a while because of the Cold War. But what ended up happening is that after the Cold War, especially, space opened up to consider them in integrated fashion. And so the UN norms say that within their sphere of activity and influence, not to stand in the shoes of government, but within their sphere of activity and influence, companies do have human rights obligations. And that obligation is simple. Number one, to do no harm, not to be a direct violator, not to be complicit in violations, and simultaneously to do what good you can. Now, the latter is, of course, harder because, it's the job of governments, especially, to provide for economic, social, and cultural rights, because they're explicitly conditioned in the treaty as depending on the resources within society. And so it's not the company's job to step into the shoes of government and, for example, provide health care. But if there's no government in a place like, in an African nation where there is literally no government, effective government, what does a company do if it's there drilling for oil? Well, what's happening in practice, what's happened for a long time, is those companies are the de facto government. And if they're acting as the government, they have some obligations. If they're going to provide the services, they must do it in a way that doesn't violate rights and that helps rights. And we're seeing Coca-Cola provide antiretroviral drugs for its workers in South Africa, for example. So the UN norms are an exciting effort that cover the international civil, political, and economic, social, cultural rights. They also have process values that say that before you take actions that affect an indigenous community, for example, you consult them. And we did this at Nokia. We didn't have the norms at that time, but when we built a factory in the rainforest in Brazil, we said, what's the right thing to do? Well, let's talk to the local people that are affected before we build the factory. We had a dialogue with them, a stakeholder dialogue. And that was what the norms suggest you do. Similarly, if you're providing security for services for your plant, to protect your plant, either by private security forces or hiring either government on-duty or off-duty military or police forces to protect your plant, you do your due diligence, as you should from any risk management perspective. You make sure you're not hiring people that were former human rights violators, like death squads in Guatemala or El Salvador, or people that have been involved in violations of, as happened with Shell in Nigeria in 1995, when they were accused and roundly accused by world public opinion of being complicit in the death of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Now, these issues are not going away. Unfortunately, we are still seeing violations, despite the increased normative development that's going on. Just in the last couple of weeks, Amnesty International did a report updating its prior reports saying that there's still problems with Chevron and Shell in Nigeria. The security forces are still killing people with impunity. And as you're probably aware, if you follow the news, there have been several deaths of people, protesters at Shell and Chevron factories in the last year. So, there are still these major problems. At the larger level, aside from individual company incidents, we have a serious problem with the macro perspective, the real macro perspective. And that's evidenced by persistent poverty and inequality in the world. The UN Human Development Report once again this year says that poverty and inequality are increasing. Now, why is that of concern to all of us? It's of concern because if that happens, eventually businesses won't have any consumers to sell to. There's a shrinking middle class, there's no market, and of course there's also major backlash possible, both in terms of companies having protesters at their plants, but also in terms of security. I mean, you actually have things like the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas being Bush was shooed out of Latin America, basically, last week when he was visiting Argentina and Brazil. So without a more ethical globalization, there's not going to be a sustainable, effective form of capitalism. So there really is a strong business case, even at the macro level, I would argue, for making sure that business is not part of the problem, but part of the solution. And I'll stop there. We can talk a little bit more about some of the companies like the Gap and HP and Barclays Bank that are actually road testing the norms, these common level playing field platform norms that try to pull the best of the different regional and all of these other confusing, disparate standards, some of which are very good. I don't mean to disparage them, but it is impossible for a company to comply with, 100 different codes and the varied expectations. So there really needs to be a rationalization. What are the key norms that we need to comply with? And then more learning and sharing of best practices as to how we do it.
But there are standards that are always changing. There are moving targets for companies. How do you keep up with that? And if you could comment on the upcoming ISO standards on CSR. Is that a positive thing, negative thing, and compared to maybe the UN Global Compact? And of course, they're very different in nature.
Well, I'll start by saying that I know that when we conduct our audits and program assessments and working with companies especially, if we find, many times we will find that the company isn't compliant, not necessarily because of their own standards, but of the other standards that we're using to evaluate that company's performance or the supplier's performance. And so what we tend to do is we turn that back around and establish a dialogue with the company and with the suppliers as to what do you think you should do, given that you may be compliant on a lot of your own internal standards, but here's where we've pointed out that you can actually improve your performance. And so we're doing a lot more training and consulting and sort of advising around if you don't have a standard on prison labor, for instance, but that has been established as something that a lot of companies are engaging and discussing about whether they should be supplying from the prisons, then we'll have a dialogue with the company to say, how important do you think this is in terms of incorporating that into your vendor compliance guides, into your code of conduct, and how do you reflect that? The other thing I'll just say is that it's even difficult for an organization like ours to keep up with the growing number of standards and initiatives. And what we basically just try to do is to identify what's sort of common ground and common understanding with a lot of our different clients in terms of what they think is most important. And then we also try to look at government institutions and other sort of objective independent bodies to identify how the standards are continuously updated.
Yeah, I mean, the approach that we've generally taken, and the reason that we haven't revised our code of conduct in 10 years, is that you can't have a moving target for your manufacturers. You can't keep changing every year what they have to comply with, but where you've seen us make changes is at the policy level. So when we go in, when we audit, what does our remediation plan look like? You've seen us refer to the ETI base code, to SA 8000. What's interesting is that our suppliers, particularly as we've developed a balanced scorecard, as social responsibility becomes part of decision making, our suppliers are suddenly interested in going above and beyond the basis in our code of vendor conduct. So you see the suppliers actually saying, how can I achieve SA 8000 certification? What training programs can I implement? Which I think in our view is the ideal situation. We don't want to be hammering them saying you have to reach this level. We want them coming to us and saying, okay, how can we do even more than what you're asking? So I think that's been a positive development. What we are watching, I mean, we would love to adopt an industry-wide code that everybody was subject to, but because it hasn't emerged yet, I think we're sitting back, we're watching, we're evolving parts that we can, depending on what organizations we're involved with. But in the future, if something emerges, I think you'll see GAP joining.
Yeah. Just to add a bit to that, I think that my interest in this is somebody that previously had to also work with all of these disparate codes is we want something that is fairly clear and simple for business to understand. One of the problems with some of the codes is that they are extremely complex. A lot of times, it's couched in this pseudo-scientific gobbledygook language that implies that there's a single right answer, when there's not a lot of times. What you really need is not a rules-based approach. Maybe at some level for a specific company and industry, you drill down to rules ultimately. But what you've got to have is a real comprehensive agreement on standards, not general principles as general as the Global Compact, which were good at the time, when they were enacted after Kofi Annan suggested that they be put in place in 1999 at Davos. But they are very general. It just says, companies shall respect human rights. What does that mean? you've got to drill down below that. And that's why I like personally the UN norms, which in turn reference a lot of the other key standards, the OECD guidelines, SA 8000, for example. And then what companies can do is have a useful checklist to kind of take it down to the level of detail that they need. But we need a single, in my opinion, international document that brings together, in a way the norms do, imperfectly, of course, because they're a product of committee, and there are some things in there that I disagree with. But the idea is that you've got a sort of a collective action problem, you really do, with the race to the bottom globally. It may be in the system's interest to avoid that increasing poverty and inequality I mentioned, but it may be in the interest of any one company or any one country to not comply with the highest standards. And so how do you overcome that prisoner's dilemma, or that collective bargaining problem, that collective action problem? What you do in game theory is it says you have clear rules and enforcement mechanism. That's basically the sort of common denominator approach. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, there's a political problem in getting to that because, even though a lot of individual companies will say they support it, a lot of times the trade associations like the International Chamber of Commerce, the International Organization of Employers, have a knee-jerk reaction against any regulation of any kind. And yet you do have other business organizations like the Business Leaders Initiative for Human Rights, which the GAP is part of, along with some of the other companies I mentioned, or the Prince of Wales International Business Leaders Forum, or some other business groups that are now seeing the value of this common platform that sets forth, as the UN norms do, in 18 principles. It's very readable. You can read the thing in a half an hour. What the basic principles are, and then reference the other key standards. And then that would have been, for me at Nokia, when we had that rainforest situation I was talking about, a very useful checklist of saying, well, you consult, you make sure that you do not do this, you do your due diligence, and so forth and so on. You just go through the checklist, and it's a very practical, clear thing. That's what we need. Now, how are we going to get there? Right now, the Special Representative for Human Rights in Business, John Ruggie, that Kofi Annan has appointed, is considering the norms actively. They have survived and prospered through a couple of rigorous reviews at the Commission of Human Rights. There was a very strong effort to kill them. But these UN norms for transnational corporations are still alive and kicking. They were welcomed at the last commission in February of this year. And, he is now in the process of determining their status vis-a-vis the other instruments that are sort of the key instruments out there. And I would hope that we have support from the private sector for this initiative, because that's, in my opinion, what we need to address the problem that you're talking about.
So most of the standards seem to be OECD-based. Are they embraced by companies outside of the OECD zone? And if there happens to be a normative law, global normative law, what would be the enforcement mechanism for that law? And simply is, are the norms competing with one another? Are there incentives? What kind of incentives exist for countries outside of the OECD zone to comply with the standards? And maybe, if I can put this even in more general, the panel question is, do these standards actually have impact on the ground? Have you seen any externalities? GAP suppliers maybe are now compliant, but are there larger impact also? If you could, I don't know who'd like to take that. You don't all have to take it either.
I do want to address the OECD. I think an interesting development this year has been the emergence of the new standard in China, and it's going to be interesting to see what impact that has. Now, the problem is it doesn't have a ton of credibility with certain sets of stakeholders because there's no freedom of association clause, particularly with the trade union. So it's going to be interesting. We're certainly watching with interest. Our suppliers are asking if we comply with this, is this enough? We come back and say, well, you still need some aspect of parallel means within the Chinese context. I think what we're seeing, as you see more and more integration of social responsibility into business, you're starting to see suppliers based in developing countries saying, okay, I want to implement this for me. They're also recognizing that in many respects, this does help them run a better business. So if you're more efficient, you have less overtime, your workers are happier, you actually are more productive, you are making more money. And GAP actually is measuring you as well on how you're doing that. So I think you have to have some sort of tangible business interest, but as that's coming out more and more, as we're seeing more studies on that, we're starting to see the suppliers take ownership and by way of that, also driving it within their own countries. So in Sri Lanka, for example, we've got a couple of really fabulous suppliers, and I think they're trying to take it out to a lot of their colleagues and say, okay, you need to be doing this as well. This is the right way to be doing business. It's also the best way to be doing business. So it's exciting. I mean, it's at sort of a nation phase at the moment, but I think it's growing.
Yeah, I was going to mention the code in China as well, and we just held a supplier conference with about 150 suppliers in China to not only discuss what opportunities there were to remediate problems at the factory levels, but what are the opportunities to discuss the confusion and the opportunities with all these different standards, and how can the suppliers sort of react and address a lot of the issues that are demanded of them by multiple brands and multiple stakeholders. And it was very interesting dialogue because it was a focus on suppliers and on the factories, but the brands and other stakeholders were sort of engaged in that effort. And so we're seeing a lot more of these sort of more country-based and industry-based conferences and forums to really discuss how to interpret the different standards and what it actually means in terms of the need for the suppliers to be more proactive versus they have to wait for the dialogue with the brands to help them enforce these codes.
Can I just add, in terms of the Chinese context, we last year initiated, along with a number of other brands, some dialogue with the Chinese government, and that really was sort of going to the government level and talking about how better labor standards actually makes China more competitive. And it was well received. I mean, it's still at a beginning phase, but I think when you start to see dialogues like that, looking potentially at the regulatory level, you suddenly see a lot more interest at the country level.
I think that's a very important point. I mean, China is an intractable problem in terms of human rights, obviously. The idea that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization just hasn't happened because the government has so much power it can calibrate the degree of freedom based on what it wants. And yet, this is one of the most attractive avenues for furthering political freedom. As you just heard Monica say, the Chinese government does understand they listen to what business wants. And if businesses explain, our consumers care about this. We cannot have forced labor in this factory. We cannot countenance two sets of books, which we had in Nokia. After I left, actually, there was a film produced on what was happening right after I left. The film is called A Decent Factory, and it's very disturbing. One of Nokia's subcontractors.
Nothing to do with your departure.
No, it had nothing to do with my departure. It was actually well after I left. The film just came out this year. But it was involving a subcontractor of Nokia that was not complying with the new minimum labor law in China, the minimum wage law, and they had two sets of books, really, which is quite common in many different countries. And yet, that's obviously, it's like the fire extinguisher problem on a more serious scale. And yet, if we explain to the Chinese government and those suppliers and subcontractors that this is not possible, our consumers will not buy our products if we're not complying with basic international norms, and our lenders won't lend us money, the sources of capital will punish us on the stock market. If this comes out, our stock price will drop. They will understand that and work with you. And Chinese government is also starting to understand the role of an independent judiciary and the rule of law. It's still, of course, not there. It's still a major problem. You basically have what Stephen Breyer of the Supreme Court calls telephone justice, and that's what happens in a lot of cases. The powerful can make their views known and get the results they want. But it was a major problem, and business cares about this as a problem. And they're powerful business voices in China, both doing business there and businesses within China are speaking up. Which brings me to your question about the OECD countries and the enforcement. And the reality is, even though there's a lot of movement in developing countries as well on this, the most transnationals are from the developed world, of course. And if they set forth that these are their requirements in their supply chain, as the GAP has done and as Verite is encouraging its clients to do, you will start to see results. And we are starting to see results. As Monica alluded, child labor is much worse of a problem just in the last few years. It's still a problem. I mean, we still are seeing it. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, many reports of egregious situations, but it's less of a problem. The problem of sexual harassment is still very, very serious. The problem of discrimination against women is still a major global problem that's affecting development and that macro picture adversely that I referenced. But ultimately, these norms are a sort of enforcement on their own. Louis Hinken, the distinguished international law scholar, says, well, these people that say international law is not law because there's no enforcement mechanism are really wrong. It is law because most people comply with it most of the time, or else would have, a really unstable situation. And actually, we are now starting to see more powerful enforcement mechanisms with teeth. And I mentioned the ATCA lawsuits, the Alien Tort Claims Act. There's a couple of $100 billion in liability pending in the U.S. courts. That model of domestic litigation is also happening now in Australia, in the UK, and in other countries. So that's one thing. You go up from there, you have regulatory agencies. The U.S. and in most developed countries now have anti-discrimination laws. They comply with human rights for the most part. They have laws against, forced labor or sexual trafficking or what have you. And that's starting to spread around the world as well. So you've got regulatory agencies. You have these multilateral treaties. The trade treaties are increasingly starting to include some references to labor and human rights, although weakly. That's starting to, to improve a bit. And now you have these multilateral efforts at the international level that I think are starting to come together, with the standards organizations, but also this new normative instrument from the UN. So enforcement is still a problem, certainly. But I think that, the market power of businesses insisting that this be part of their business model is one of the best hopes we have for actual progress in the future.
How can information technology help collect the information that is needed, and how well is it integrated into these measurement systems as we develop new metrics?
In our experience, the challenge has been that IT has not kept up with the pace of development here. So just looking at the GAP situation, our IT systems are completely antiquated for what we really need to measure this. Like, our ideas and our approach to measurement has far outpaced what our IT systems are capable of. We're actually in the middle of trying to adopt a new system. I think the challenge that we run into is many of the providers, particularly the big providers that will also mesh with company systems, aren't necessarily aware of the detail level that we need. So we have to do a lot of the requirements. We have to do a lot of the work on the front end to make sure the system is compatible. There are niche players, but they may not be able to mesh well with the company systems generally. And we need things that can pull from our production, mesh with our supply chain. It has to work there as well. Just to give you some names, I know Oracle and Siebel are one pretty good provider. Hitachi is another one. But again, it's a challenging field out there, because a lot of them really don't understand the detail of what we're getting at, and it's evolving. We're evolving it ourselves internally. It's changing every year, the way that we measure. I would advise those companies, if they want to get into it, they really need to have an ongoing discussion with companies that are at the cutting edge of this measurement so that they can evolve their systems along with it. They're also expensive, and they're expensive to update. So you need a system that can continue to evolve with this field.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it's an incredible opportunity, both on the entrepreneurial side and in looking for opportunities down the road and working in this field. I did some work with SAP at their headquarters, and I know what it looks like when they've got people coming in on a global basis to establish requirements of the next sort of stage of development on systems like this. And I've been wondering just when it was going to happen that some of these, companies are going to roll out something to the effect of CSR, comprehensive CSR systems, not only to collect information, but also to aggregate it in a way that we can evaluate the impact of all these efforts that are occurring. And that would help a lot of the governmental organizations and the NGOs who are trying to make the business case to the companies and make the case to other institutions that these initiatives and these efforts are really viable, and they do really help address issues like poverty. And what we've been seeing is we've been seeing the development of some of these systems and ideas, but nothing is comprehensive, I think, is like Monica's saying, to keep up with the developments in the field, especially with regard to standards.
Yeah, I don't have much to add except the systems I've seen are clunky and bad. So I think there is an opportunity there. But it's a tough one. It does require working with the cutting edge companies. I wanted to we dropped your GC question about the Global Compact. In the eyes of some companies, particularly companies that are not doing a good job of complying with human rights, there is tension between the Global Compact and these other norms, and they want to keep their eggs in the Global Compact basket. So again, the problem with that is that the Global Compact, I think, serves an important preliminary purpose of defining the basic principles and sharing best practices, but it's strictly voluntary, and it's been subjected to some legitimate criticism that some of its members are actually using it in what they call blue wash, like the blue helmets from the UN. They're using it as kind of public relations cover for continued violations, and there's some prominent examples of that. So, the Global Compact is good as far as it goes, but it's at that very general standards level, principles level. We need to drill it down into standards and rules for the industries and companies, but keeping them still clear and simple, as I mentioned. And that's where, again, the software is going to have to, be very, very user-friendly, and, you automate as much as you can. But there's some things in here that are just not going to be ultimately automated. There'll still be a lot of a human interaction, as there is with a lot of good software programs. The solution to enforcement is and will remain pluralistic. It's basically the norms contained in Article 16, I think it is, not a heavy-handed approach saying this is the way these will be enforced, but it contains a roadmap to possible ways of enforcement. And it mentions possibly adding some illustrative private sector communications. Complaints could go to UN treaty bodies, for example. That's one possibility. National courts, national legislatures, national regulatory agencies, other perhaps to be developed future monitoring capabilities by the International Labor Organization or by a special mandate. Say John Ruggie, the current special representative of the UN, may be given a mandate to receive complaints. That's actually the way the UN system has developed. Human rights, although they're weakly and ineffectively enforced, there have been some positive enforcement mechanisms in the human rights field because individual complaint mechanisms are available under optional protocols to some of the treaties. There's a confidential, what's called a 1503 procedure for state-to-state complaints and so forth. So there's a whole panoply of enforcement mechanisms. Harold Koh, the dean of Yale Law School, former Clinton administration official in charge of human rights, speaks about enforcement with an analogy akin to driving on a road, where at first it starts, you drive on the right side because it's convenient to do so. And then you may start because of a speeding ticket, a compliance model. And then you start to operationalize the norms internally. And what I'm saying is that the real change will happen when these companies, their employees, operationalize, when they communicate through these sustainability and human rights and labor rights, environmental reports, as a lot of them are doing now, what they're doing, and then consumers will get educated, and stakeholders collectively will enforce it in this sort of pluralistic model that I'm talking about. So it's going to take, it's not a silver bullet. It's going to take a lot of continued effort by a lot of players, in my opinion. The World Bank has new human rights initiatives as well. It's part of the picture as well. Got a new report.
The moderators.
Okay. We do have your supply chain question. We didn't want to leave the supply chain question hanging, right? Do you want to say something about?
Can you repeat it?
How deep into the?
How far down do you think we can go down the supply chain in terms of holding a company accountable? There was a panel in this room yesterday, and McDonald's was asked that question, and she wasn't allowed to answer. I think she wanted to answer. We chatted afterwards, but she was saying that McDonald's is looking at, for example, if they're buying beef, they're only looking at the processor's compliance, who's processing the beef and selling it to them, but they're not looking at the farms actually. So.
I mean, it's definitely a good question. It's one that we're facing now. What I have seen both in reporting and in monitoring is a trend to try to define a boundary somewhere, because many different stakeholders are approaching us with many different ideas. Some saying we should go all the way down to the cotton farms, and what are the conditions on the cotton farms. Now, we are a big buyer of cotton, but you think about how far removed that is from any sort of whether direct or indirect relationship we have with the business. It's pretty far. What I'm seeing is sort of a matrixed approach that's trying to grade it based on the amount of influence or control that a company has. Different companies have started to define that in their own way. I think Gap is going to need to do that as well, because there are plenty of groups that are approaching us and saying, you need to do something with cotton. I don't know if we'll get there or not. But the idea, I mean, it's hard enough to do it in third-party owned facilities that we contract with. But there is a direct relationship there. It's hard. I mean, we don't own them, so we still have trouble sort of convincing them, but at least we can use our business as the leverage. When you are so far removed, they sort of look at you and say, well, why should I do what you say? It's not like you're going to be giving me a PO or anything. So it's an emerging question that I think more and more companies are going to deal with.
This issue's come up in the electronic industry as well. We just had, with the U.S. Department of Labor, we did a conference in India to look at what are the most sort of prominent issues in the supply chain for electronics companies, and one of the major issues is e-waste. And in particular, there are a lot of entrepreneurs out there, or just individual families, women and children, who are breaking apart the motherboards and through the sort of recycling effort, and are exposed to a lot of hazardous materials. And so the industry is trying to come together with a lot of stakeholders to say who's responsible for this, and how can we protect these families and these children from working in this industry, but also not get in the way of the fact that this is an economic, opportunity for these individuals, and to really address the sort of issue carefully. So it's in its sort of beginning stages of trying to identify who's responsible throughout the supply chain for an issue like that.
I'll just add that I think that it depends a lot on the industry and the company, because the supply chains, if you think about it, are very different, say for Ford or for the Gap, which competes a lot on brand and quality, or for Walmart. Walmart was just sued a couple of weeks ago, and its supply chain, of course, is very different. It's tens and thousands of suppliers, and a lot of piecework done sometimes, in housework, and informal, even sort of black market suppliers to keep the price down. And yet, Gap and Walmart do have different types of control over their suppliers. And so the concept of sphere of activity and influence and control is a very important one. What does a company know? To what extent does it really control? Does it have bargaining power over that supplier? And how deep into the chain does it have it? And then what positive or negative influence can it exert in each case?
Another trend that we're also seeing is the consolidation of suppliers for companies, and and the question that comes up regularly is, what's the responsibility of the company that is closing down a factory in one particular region and moving it to a next, or closing it down? With regard to the consolidation, what responsibility does the company have for that community? And we've been doing a lot of work with a number of companies who've called us and have said that they had an unexpected reaction from the community in which they closed a factory, even though they thought that they really gave a lot of sensitivity to the community issues, and they'd established some education programs and initiatives for the community. But it's a difficult issue for the company to address and figure out what their responsibility is, and it does require a lot of multi-stakeholder engagement with the local government officials and with the local NGOs to figure out what they can do and what they have the capacity to do.
Can I just add one more thing? In the recent meeting that we had for the GRI working group, it was an interesting discussion because we were debating the issue of how far a company should be required to report in its supply chain. And on the group, you have both brands and retailers, as well as NGOs and trade unions. And it was interesting because the suppliers felt very strongly that the brands' responsibility only went to a certain level. And they're like, actually, it's our responsibility to go further down into that supply chain, because we're the ones buying the fabric, we're the ones buying that, and we really think that we need to drive that among our peers as opposed to you brands regulating it for us. So it was just an interesting discussion. We'll see where it goes as the standard is developed. But
are there any studies being done on developing matrix that look at the inherent conflict between pushing for more CSR standards, strict CSR standards, while keeping up the productivity?
It's a great question. We're still at the beginning phases. What I can tell you is that I'm not sure I'd agree with that it's an inherent conflict. It may be in the short term, but not in the long term. And what we've seen, just as we've undergone some supply chain redesigns on our own, is that when we miss our delivery time, or we miss our PO to vendor time, we miss getting the sort of the samples to the vendors on time, we're also ruining our own supply chain. We're adding cost to us. So the way in which we can reach our business partners is to say, if you make your decisions appropriately and we measure you against that, not only is that going to help the factories, but it's going to cost us less too. But it's a new way of working, especially in apparel. I think other industries are further ahead in this area. It's just become more natural, but it's a pretty logical way of thinking. We're in the midst right now we're part of a working group with the ETI, exploring, sort of talking to our business partners and just trying to understand what's happening. Hopefully a report will come out in a couple of years with the results.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of trainings, one of about 60,000 workers in China recently on life skill issues, economic literacy, health issues, infectious diseases. Also, I just came back from Bangladesh, and we're doing a big training there with one of our clients at the factory levels, training about 15,000 women workers. And there are a lot more companies and organizations asking what's the overall impact of that work, both on a productivity, efficiency sort of level that's of concern to the suppliers and to the brands, but also in terms of just the overall sort of social impact. And what we've been trying to identify is other organizations and stakeholders to bring together the questions of what indicators should we use to measure that impact. And if you do some trainings of workers on reproductive health rights and the women are more aware of their rights in that regard, what's the actual impact on the in the factory in terms of productivity, and can you see a decrease in the amount of doctor visits that that woman is going on a yearly basis, and that could be have an effect on increased savings and decreased costs. But the tracking of that information and also having a baseline for establishing what you're going to be evaluating is pretty tricky, and it's a challenge for us to negotiate at the supplier level to actually have the time to set up those systems and the ability to track that information, especially during the high seasons. So it's definitely an opportunity out there. I don't think that there are. We'd like to be part of more initiatives in establishing better indicators. But I agree with Monica that we have seen and we believe that it's not as much of a conflict as there's real benefits to both in looking at how the impact on a social and environmental level can help increase the value proposition that the company and the suppliers have, and vice versa.
And I'm very glad to hear that they think there's not a conflict, because that is the right answer. But the reality, of course, and it's the right answer because if you think about it, if a young girl is slave chained to a sewing machine, is working 7 days a week, 14 to 18 hours a day, she's not going to be very productive after a little while. Now, so it depends a little bit on the context, the substitutability of the labor, the level of skill involved. Agricultural laborers are often viewed as fungible, but to the extent you train the skilled workers, your employees are a very important asset that you've invested in. So even from a cold calculus, you need to treat them in a way that comports with basic human dignity so that they will be productive and enthusiastic. And that's why these norms, part of the business case is that it does help employee retention and recruitment and so forth. But sometimes there can be a conflict, obviously. If you've got one unit saying, push, 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 rush, rush, get the job done at a lower price, Walmart, say, and you've got a CSR person, who is saying we cannot do that, those units can be in conflict. Which one is going to win the day? It depends on the top leadership and their view of shareholder versus stakeholder value, their commitment, the internalization of these norms. Oxfam has a good report on this that they did about a year ago. And what they say, like some of the business literature on this and some of the legal academic, is that you've got to have an integrated approach. Part of your training must be that these aren't just abstract principles, that they really do affect our long-term, big-picture interest in our, the way our stakeholders view us and the way our company will be perceived as contributing something of value on a, the good to great idea that, is very popular right now, Jim Collins' book. The company that will be of lasting value to society and not just producing short-term quarterly profits. I think that Gap has made a lot of progress. A lot of times the progress comes out of companies that went wrong and they had some problems and now they're one of the leaders. Same thing with a lot of these other companies. The Business Leaders Initiative for Human Rights that they're a part of, they've all committed to some kinds of standards. They're road testing these UN norms. But there are, there's about 85-90% agreement on the basic content of the norms. So there you don't have a problem. But in any individual industry, in the apparel industry, you have a spectrum of bad guys and good guys, and in the extractive sector, you have a lot of bad guys. But you've got companies like BP that are doing really well, companies like Shell that are doing, better, but as I mentioned, still have problems. Companies like Exxon that still have a long way to go. So it really varies. But by having some of the largest, most profitable companies in the world, Walmart got religion 2 weeks ago. You see that? They're suddenly saying, hey, you know what? This stuff isn't, after we've been sued, it's not so bad after all. And we recognize that we can now comply, and it's not even going to cost us a lot of money. So all of a sudden, it's possible for there to be normative change. But the leaders make an impact.
Yeah, can
Let's
I-
take-
You wanna
Sorry,
add?
I just wanted to add to
Sure.
that in terms of, I feel like especially in our industry, there's been an embracement of standards, but it's the level of enforcement that differs, and you've got leaders who are really coming in and saying, this is what we mean, and we're not going to be satisfied until you do X. Whereas you've got others saying, okay, well, we'll give you some room, some wiggle room. I was just in China last week, and our field director came and said, you got to look at this. And it's a consulting company that has sprung up on mainland China that is instructing companies how to create double or triple or quadruple sets of books so that they can comply with all of the different retailers' requirements. I mean, that's literally their industry because they know. I mean, we take a very firm stance. We find double books, that's it, we're gone. And we say we don't care how many sets of books you have as long as you show us the true ones. And so working with our suppliers, they know it's a tough line. Eventually they're going to show us the books or they're going to lose our business. But there's plenty of other companies who may or may not really want to know and may not dig in. And there's a whole industry sprung up to add those layers if that's what a factory wants to do and if a company's not willing to look deeper. So you see that level of enforcement, and that's what makes it challenging in the industry too, because we take a tough line and not everybody does.
Question on wage standards.
Wage.
Right? Yeah. How do you set the right wage standards in different countries, different industries, etc.? So I guess, Monica, it comes back to you. Or
Let me start with the laggards question first. I think it's a great question. And unfortunately, at the moment, I think it's highly dependent on consumers. So when consumers are engaged, when there's a lot of media around a company, it does, like Gap and Nike, it has forced us to become a leader in the industry. The hope is that in seeing more lawsuits, both the ones that we were subject to in the past, the ones that Walmart is subject to now, this will increase awareness. It is also has the potential to increase regulation. So you're seeing in Europe, for example, the new operating and financial review requirement in the UK or the non-financial reporting requirement in France. Even the SOX requirement, although it's not specifically CSR in the US, it is sort of a form of governance based on scandals. As you see more and more of that, and as companies are required to account publicly for what they do, the hope is it will slowly level the playing field. But again, at the moment, it is still unfortunately largely dependent on consumers.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about the Equator Principles, but in the sort of financial industry, there's a bunch of shareholder activism that occurred, and as a result, since J.P. Morgan Chase hadn't joined the Equator Principles, they established in response the Office for Environmental Affairs that reports to the chairman directly, and as a lagger, they now have a very public commitment to trying to sort of work on these issues. So I think, like Monica was saying, there are a number of different ways that I know that we get calls as to why laggers in the industry want to work with us. And some of it's because of shareholder activism. Some of it's because they're getting nervous that they're sitting and watching this all happen, and they're not exactly sure what to do, or if they should sit tight, or if they should respond, and how publicly they should respond. And interestingly enough, I was in a meeting recently with a company, and someone said, well, I'm not sure how to react to everything that's happening with Walmart. I don't know if it's going to make it more difficult on a global basis for companies to actually do work in this industry, or if companies are going to get scared from actually taking a leadership role in these efforts. And it was an interesting dialogue that we had, because they were definitely considering what they wanted to do in regards to all the new standards and their efforts in managing their supply chain, but they weren't exactly sure how to react. So the public pressure and the stakeholder activism, the shareholder activism, consumer activism, and also the just general risks and lawsuits do start the grassroots sort of thinking as to what